Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carolyn Wilson, and I'm the coordinator for GASP, which is the Groton Alliance for Substance Abuse Prevention. And we're a community-based coalition hoping to reduce and prevent substance abuse in youth here in Groton. And I see some coalition members out in the audience, so thank you so much for coming. And lots of new faces, so thank you so much for being here. We're super excited to be here. I want to thank the library, the Mystic Noank Library, for hosting, especially Mito the cat, who lives on the second floor. He's a bit of an internet celebrity, so we're happy to be here. So today is the second day of National Prevention Week. It is a national observance started by SAMHSA. Every day of this week has a different observance. And today, Monday, is the day dedicated to mental health and wellness. Every day has a little bit of a different theme. So we're super excited to have Dr. Peacock here with us today. A couple of people have asked me how I met Dr. Peacock. I just met Dr. Peacock, actually. And so I'm getting excited for tonight, and I want to tell you a little bit about him, and then he can tell you a little bit about himself as well. Dr. Peacock is currently writing a book, and it's telling a story about his life. Dr. Peacock was a Paul Robeson Scholar when he attended Rutgers, and he also attended Harvard Divinity School. He went to medical school at University of Vermont and completed his residency at Duke and was the chief resident at Duke VA Medical Center. Dr. Peacock currently practices here in Connecticut, and he speaks all over the country. So without further ado, I will welcome Dr. Peacock up front, and he can tell you a little bit more about himself. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming out tonight. Am I all set with the clicker? I never know how to use which one. This is my advance. I was asking myself on my way over here, who would come out tonight? So I'm really glad that you guys would come out tonight. I was trying to think, where am I going to eat? So I'm hoping some recommendations will come when I leave here, too. All right, I'm going to begin by telling you a lot about me. And most of the talk is going to be about my life and my struggles with mental illness myself, and my journey through the system, and what made me want to become a psychiatrist. So this is circa 1986. This was a good look, guys. I don't know if you recognize that. I try to tell my wife all the time, the mullet was pretty good looking back in the 80s, and I don't know. She actually says I don't look much different. What do you think? I moisturize. I think that it seems to make a difference here. So maybe I was about 15 or 16 years old here, and that was my first time ever having a panic attack. And I remember that day very well. I was a junior in high school, and my heart started pounding, and I'm not sure if any of you have ever had a panic attack. It's terrifying. I thought I was going to die. I went down to the nurse's office, and I told her that I'm terrified, I don't know what's happening, my heart was pounding, I wasn't sure what was going on. She sent me home, and when I got home, I told my parents, I'm terrified, I'm dying, I don't know what's happening. They rushed me up to the hospital, they did an EKG on me, the doctor came in, a well-intentioned doctor, and he was looking at me and giving me the best advice possible, and he told me to go home, it's just anxiety, and I should drink some warm milk. And I went home and I drank warm milk, and guess what? I drank warm milk the next morning, and I did it for several days, waiting for the milk to work, and it just wasn't working. And I continued to have these panic attacks, and they continued to go on. And I was growing very depressed, and a lot of somatic stuff. And what I mean by that, my whole body was sore and achy, and I always felt sick. I got to the point where I started contemplating suicide. And so I started, after several months of this, I wrote letters to my father, to my mother, to all my friends, and I told them that I can't live this life anymore. I can't do this. So I planned my suicide. My mother found my letters, and it was a terrifying day for her. And she knew that I wanted to die. I was able to see a psychologist. And it was my first encounter with a psychologist, and I didn't know what to make of it, and I didn't know what to think. And I go in, and the psychologist, really smart guy, just wasn't able to connect with me. He told me my id was overpowering my ego. I'm still not even sure what he was talking about, but somehow I had this id that was causing all my problems. And from there, I continued to get worse. And my school counselor at the time, he was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, and he had these wonderful little catchphrases that didn't make a difference in my life. And I would say I should do something, and he said something like, "The shoulds live in the woods." Well, that made a difference in my life. And so I continued to struggle with this, on and on. Every day feeling like something's wrong inside of me, I'm broken. And after that first panic attack, I did feel broken. I'm going to move this out of the way. I ended up seeing a medical doctor after a couple years. And the medical doctor, his answer for me was, "You have a chemical imbalance." And that was the teaching back in late 80s and early 90s, that somehow low levels of serotonin fell off, and I was unfortunate. And he prescribed me an antidepressant. And I was started on Zoloft. And it worked until it didn't work. And then I went on to another medication, and I kept on waiting for the magic pill that would make me feel okay. And what every single one of them missed was how critically important early development is. Let's see if I can advance this slide. Oh, there I am. Still pretty good looking there. I grew up in a house with trauma and violence, and they didn't ask those questions. Psychiatry back in the day was very reductionistic, that we were machines that somehow got broken. But the first 2 years of life are so critically important, and they define your life in ways that are amazing and powerful, but you can suffer for the rest of your life if those questions aren't asked. And they asked the symptom checklist questions. And yes, I had anhedonia, and I had depression, and I had anxiety, and I had panic, and the expansion of diagnoses from generalized anxiety. One guy even thought that it was maybe bipolar spectrum illness, and they kept on looking for the pill, but they never asked those questions. So I was raised in a house with a father that, don't get me wrong, he loved me. He really did, but he was so damaged and so ill-prepared to be my father. He was an alcoholic, and he was violent, and I witnessed him hitting my mother. And we moved around often, from apartment to apartment. He worked occasionally. He had a 6th or 7th grade education. So my life was chaos. Early developmental trauma not only stays embedded, but it alters the structure and function of the brain that lasts for a lifetime until you know how to do trauma work. Nobody knew anything in the 80s or 90s. It's an emerging thing that we're just starting to talk about now. But they missed it. So I went searching. And so here I was, 16 years old, and I was looking for answers. And I would go to the bookstore, and I'd go to the library, and I would read every book I could read. I flunked out of 8th grade, and I was kicked out of high school. I wasn't exactly the kid prepared to be the doctor, but I wanted to make my life better. I didn't want to suffer the rest of my life. I memorized The Road Less Traveled. I don't know if any of you guys read that. I loved that book. And Feeling Good by Burns. I kept on reading and searching. I kept going to health food stores looking for the supplements. I took SAMHSA and St. John's ward, and I kept on meeting. I met with every possible type of psychotherapist out there, CBT, and the list goes on, from psychodynamic, and kept on looking for that. And it wasn't until really in the last few years of my life that I began to understand how critically important. And some of you may be familiar with the ACEs, and that's the adverse childhood stuff. that will change your life, and young people will live the rest of their life suffering. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD, early developmental trauma will even cause things like obesity, increased risk for cancers, incarceration. You want to wonder what happened to most of the people that are in prison today? Childhood, it matters. Educational achievement. So when people say they want to make a difference in the world, it's this epidemic. So when I hear politicians talking and they want to talk about what they can do, we have a hidden epidemic that's feeding mental illness today in this early childhood development and trauma, attachment stuff. Kids need to feel loved, safe, and nurtured. And yet we have a whole industry built on the idea that we just have people with chemical imbalances. It's pretty sad if all the people with the chemical imbalances were the kids who were abused, mistreated, neglected. Those are my two little boys. Good-looking kids. I think they look a little more like my wife. That's my brother-in-law, Tommy. 2 years ago, Tommy went out to the backyard and tied a rope around a tree and hung himself. He was high on crystal meth. He was struggling to find meaning in his life. People ask me what's the most important stuff in life. It's us. It's that interconnection. We know that. Meaning matters. All of us will suffer. Every single one of us will suffer in this life. It's the relationship to suffering that matters. You can suffer, or you can suffer with meaning. Tommy was suffering in ways in which his life had no meaning for him. He couldn't transform that, so he killed himself. I was tasked with the job of telling my oldest boy, who was 7 at the time, that his uncle had died. I wanted to rush him through it. I didn't want him to hurt. I picked him up at school and I said, Tommy died. He began to cry. And I didn't want my boy to hurt. So I said everything was okay quickly, and I took him out for an ice cream. Here I am, a psychiatrist, and I didn't know what to do. We're sitting at Friendly's eating an ice cream, and the night before, his uncle just hung himself. And then we stumbled around Toys R Us. I had no idea how to meet my boy where he was at in that moment. I thought protecting him was shielding him, and I was wrong. 3 months later, he began to develop real symptoms of OCD. So he kept on checking for germs and washing his hands. And he'd come home and his hands were raw and red. We limited his hand washing to twice a day. I would put lotion on it. He'd touch something, and I would have him touch it again and say, you're going to be safe. I was trying to train his brain. That's exposure response prevention. In my residency, I was trained in one of those techniques. I know the techniques, but I was missing the real stuff here again. And it was a game of whack-a-mole. He'd come home every day, something else scared him, or something he saw on TV, and then I'd do exposure-based therapy, and we kept on playing that game of whack-a-mole. And he kept on getting worse. And then one night, I'm lying upstairs watching a little TV, and my wife comes running upstairs and says, Hunter, he won't eat dinner tonight. He says I poisoned him. I go downstairs and I look at my little boy. His skin is flushed, his pupils are dilated. I can tell he's filled with anxiety. And I also know in that moment that would be his entry into the mental health system. So here my kid is 7 years old. I've been down this road and I know the mental health system really well. I look at him and I think to myself, if I take him to one of my colleagues, he's going to be put on an SSRI, Zoloft, Prozac, maybe add on an atypical antipsychotic like Risperdal. That's standard. We've tried the therapies. And I also know that the expansion of diagnoses will follow, and I understand the labels of mental illness, and I understand how that will be his existence. I get that. 7 years old, and this was the life my boy would have. But I didn't believe that was the complete answer, because just a few months ago, he was okay. Just a few months before that. I looked at my wife and I said, what are we missing? what has happened in his life to make it so unsafe today for him? And we both said, Tommy died. I sat him down on the couch. My wife sat next to us. I said, what are you afraid of? And he said, Dad, I am afraid of everything. And he was tearing up. And I said, what are you really afraid of? He said, if Tommy could die, Mommy could die. You could die, Dad. I got it. I couldn't take away his suffering, that loss. He needed to go through that grief process. So I invited him to close his eyes and go back into that memory of the day that Tommy died. And he started to cry. And we wept with him and we held him. And we kept on going through it again and again until he processed it. And I asked him what he needed in that moment. He said, I needed to know that you would be with me. You won't leave me, that I'm safe in this world. And I told him that I loved him and he was safe. The next day I woke up to find that he was still anxious. I get it. But then 2 days later, a little better. And then a week later, not washing his hands. Pretty sure last night we had a fight with him to take a shower. He was able to process that, and it was amazing to see that. After that, I began to think, what happened to my life? I know my developmental trauma. I get that. Days before my first panic attack, my grandfather had died. My father wasn't close to him. But I walked in on my dad crying, and nobody was there to comfort me. Because I realized in that moment, if my grandfather could die, my father could die. And then who would take care of me? There is power in the relationships. And the most healing thing we have is this interconnected relationship. That's my boy today. Maybe he does look a little bit like me. My first semester in medical school, I got a call that my father was in the hospital and he was dying. I rushed to the hospital to be with him. It was a painful day for me to be able to have to be there, but I had to show up for that. I walk into the room to see him lying there, and his lungs are filling with fluid, and I can hear it rattling, even in the hallway. I remember my father used to hold me above his head when I was a little boy, and he was hurting, man. He was damaged in so many ways, but he would say, someday you could be amazing. He wanted that for me. I know that. I placed my head on my father's chest for the last time that day. And I said goodbye to the father that hurt me and connected to the father that loved me. I think often now about how my father would never meet my children, but I was so wrong. Every day my father meets my children. When I take a drink out of a soda or something, I'll say, take the poison out, just like my dad said. Or I'll get on the ground and wrestle with him. Or we arm wrestle. My father would call it breaking wrists. And so my boys break wrists with my dad, and they didn't even know they were doing it. Our fathers, our mothers, our history is carried forth in the ways in which we connect to each other. So when I told my boy that I would be there for him and I would not leave him, I know that to be true now, because in my absence, he'll still have me. People often ask, what is the goal of being a parent? And people will say, it doesn't come with a manual, and I would say those things. I think the answer is pretty simple. The goal is to give them the tools to survive in our absence so that when we die, they don't die. Because of my father, and because of even the stuff I went through that was so painful, I'm a better man, I'm a better father, I'm a better husband, I'm a better doctor because I've lived this life. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.